Hello, everybody. My name is Brenna Greer, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of History here. And I want to welcome you to this third presentation of 4 of this year's Tanner Summit. And the summit is a reimagination of the Tanner Conference, which actually celebrates its 20th anniversary this year. And so in place of the usual conference that takes place on campus, we're offering this virtual summit as a space or a way for the members of the community to reflect on and share their experiential learning during this truly significant historical moment. And so before I turn things over to our panelists, I want to take the opportunity to encourage you to consider 2 things. One, please check out the final panel, which takes place tomorrow at 11 a.m. In the same format. And the subject of that panel is the 2020 election. And so obviously very relevant. And I will certainly tune in because I look forward to hearing our students speak to that topic, particularly since this election is unprecedented in so many ways. In addition, I want to invite you all to participate in a special initiative unique to this year's Tanner. The Tanner Summit has partnered with StoryCorps to make it possible for members of the community, including faculty, staff, and students, to record interviews with other members of the community or people important to them about their individual experiences of this tumultuous period in relationship to the 4 themes covered by this year's summit panels. And those 4 themes are the COVID-19 pandemic, the changing environment, the movement for racial justice, this panel, and the 2020 election. So as is always the case with StoryCorps, those interviews will be preserved at the Library of Congress and also in the college archives. And so you're really encouraged to do those interviews by Friday for the sake of the Tanner Summit. And I really do encourage everyone to do that. I think it would be wonderful to have those remembrances of this really unique time. So for more information about how to record a StoryCorps interview or anything related to the Tanner Summit, please visit the website at wellesley.edu/Tanner. Again, wellesley.edu/Tanner. Okay, so again, the topic for this panel is the movement for racial justice. And 4 students on the panel are going to share recent experiences that relate to this theme, if not the movement itself. And they will discuss how those experiences have shaped their larger understanding of the issue. And the format will be as follows. First, each panelist will give roughly a 5-minute presentation describing their relevant experience. They will introduce themselves before doing so. And then I will facilitate a 15 to 20 minute conversation between our presenters that allows them to further draw on their individual experiences and engage one another while speaking more to the panel's theme. And then finally, there'll be a Q&A session of about 5 to 10 minutes, and I will take questions at that point. So I encourage you to type any questions that you have into the Q&A section or the chat box. And during the Q&A, I'll select from that box to ask our panelists some questions, okay? So then I'm going to take this opportunity then to turn it over to the panelists, and I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves, tell you their name, their class year, their major, and then they will take 3 to 5 minutes to share their reflections or their experiences that are related to the fight for racial justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Teran then.
Hi, my name is Teran Chapis. I'm a junior, class of 2022. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a political science major. This summer, I was supposed to go abroad. Everything was planned and ready to go. And then when the COVID-19 pandemic sent us evacuated in March, I had no idea what I was going to do with my summer. So I ended up looking at the Hive projects that Wellesley alums graciously were offering internships for students. And I saw this internship with Informed Georgians for Justice, which is something I wouldn't have thought of doing with my summer, but I was so interested. Informed Georgians for Justice, IGJ, is a voter education criminal justice nonprofit. So we sent out questionnaires to every district attorney, sheriff, and solicitor candidate in Georgia. And we're putting the responses on a website that was publicized to all voters to help voters make decisions about those candidates that affect the criminal justice system in a local way. And kind of the key players of the criminal justice system in Georgia. So I ended up interning with IDJ, which is co-founded by an alum, Alex Joseph, class of 2010. And I had a few different roles. The most interesting one was I was calling and emailing a lot of sheriff and district attorney candidates and asking them about their questionnaire and reminding them to get it in by the deadline, which was interesting because before this summer, I couldn't exactly tell you what a district attorney did exactly. So it was an amazing learning experience. I learned so much about how local officials shape our criminal justice system and how change in our criminal justice system starts at the local level. And I was also working on social media. I'm terrible at social media. I'm terrible at Twitter, terrible at Instagram, but I ended up learning so much about how to run social media this summer. I was helping IGJ run some social media accounts to help voters find our website and our information, and answering voter questions about criminal justice in Georgia. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to say, but yeah, we partnered with the Georgia NAACP as well. And at the end of the summer, sort of connected with my IGJ internship, the NAACP in Georgia asked for a few volunteers to work on a few projects based on what we were interested in. And so I specifically am a political science major and I like studying public policy. So I got to do some research on prosecutorial accountability, which is something I also wouldn't have known much about if I hadn't done this project. So I was really excited to learn about that. And my summer experience showed me that I'm much more passionate about the criminal justice system that I had believed. And maybe I might want to spend my career working on criminal justice reform.
Great, thank you so much, Teran. Now I'm going to turn it over to Iris.
Hi everyone, my name is Iris Haastrup. I'm a junior at Wellesley and I'm an architecture major. And today I'll be talking to you about the initiative I started, Southside Grocery Pickup, which was an initiative to provide free groceries and toiletries to local communities on the south side of Chicago. I initially started this initiative seeing like the mass protests and uprisings happening in the late May and how I felt like the city of Chicago was not properly responding to either the protests and the pandemic, which was already devastating Black communities of Chicago. And when the protests happened, the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, decided to cut off food distribution at Chicago public schools. Previously, if you were a Chicago public school student and you didn't have access to food, you could go to these food distribution sites. But then during the protest, she cut them off, as I believe she quoted that like it was like unsafe or something. I don't know like her reasoning, but I know that I didn't agree with it. So I asked one of my friends, Charisma, like, oh, I'm interested in starting this initiative to provide fresh food and groceries for our community. And then she said she was interested, and I just created a flyer online with like different information for like Venmo. And then the day we were gonna give the free groceries, so if people wanted to pull up and drop off free groceries for that day, they could. And we got a tons of outpour of support from people I knew in Chicago, people I knew at Wellesley alums, and some of Wellesley staff actually decided to financially help our cause. And on the day of, I used my cousin's, for the first grocery pickup, I used my cousin's paint shop as the location for people to drop off groceries and people to pick up. And within the first 2 hours, the entire store was filled with groceries to the point where like we couldn't even, like we had almost like 10 tables. All the groceries couldn't even fit on 10 tables. Like we had to put everything that was like bottled water or canned on the ground, and all the use only tables for fresh produce. And then after that, and within the span of 3 hours, everything was gone within the store, indicating that this type of initiative is really needed for low-income Black and Brown communities. After that, after the first one, it was such a success, I decided like, oh, Juneteenth is only 2 weeks away, like might as well do something big, especially during this time. And in Chicago, like people only associate Chicago with the idea of like Black pain and Black death, but there's so many other things like Black joy to associate the city of Chicago with. So I planned this Juneteenth event, and I used the Harold Washington Cultural Center for the parking lot, the Harold Washington Cultural Center for that event. And I got almost the same amount of groceries for that day. And I received PPE from the Black Caucus Foundation, and the 13th state senator of Illinois decided to donate a lot of toiletries as well. And on the same day, I partner with a lot of different organizations. So the organization Froskate donated skateboards, Fortune House did a painting workshop, Youth for Black Lives, which I'm a part of, donated medical supplies, and two restaurants actually decided to donate hot food for the day. One restaurant donated 500 tacos for the community, and another restaurant donated 300 cupcakes for the community. And all throughout this entire time, there was performances. And I thought this event was just really well in indicating how communities can come together for the idea of advancement and joy, and specifically a time that has, and in both aspects through the pandemic and through, I feel like the constant, like as like Black Chicagoans, we're constantly traumatized, but during this time even more, there's a hyper traumatization just by seeing like Black death on the news constantly. So I wanted to facilitate a space that allowed for Black people to come together in an idea of fellowship. And it was just interesting for the experience. I was out of all the volunteers I started, I was the youngest person. I was the youngest person there, which I thought was extremely interesting. And I don't want to get like, we're going to have the panelist discussion later, so I won't say everything, but this was a really impactful experience for me and also my community. And I hope to share more with you all.
Thank you, Iris. As someone who lived on the south side of Chicago, I just find what you've done over the summer truly amazing. So I'm going to now turn it over to Josephine. And I want to encourage people, if you have questions for the individual panelists, you should also feel free to put those into the Q&A box. All right, Josephine.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So my name is Josephine Kim. I just graduated and I was a history major. Kindred Obas is also on this panel, and we've been friends since 2015. And we started a podcast together back in August. And the podcast is called More Than Five, and it's about friendship. And friendship is such a large rabbit hole. And we found it to be something very difficult to navigate during these changing times. And personally, for myself, once I was sent back to Southern California, I found it a little bit more challenging to navigate my friendships and how to respond, how to bear one another's burdens, how to be a good friend. It is not talked about as often as other relationships. So Kindred and I started this podcast about it. And we believe that friendships are a very powerful domain of healing, education, and supporting one another. So we are passionate about it, and we are excited about what it can look like in the future. But I'll save the rest for later, and Kindred will share more about it as well. Thank you.
Okay, Kindred, we'll just let you pick that up right there, okay?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kindred, like Kindred Spirit. I'm class of 2019, so I graduated last year. And Josephine, like she said, we started this podcast together. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we connected this with race. So Josephine and I made an episode called Multi-Ethnic Friendships, and we made it actually a couple of days prior to the Breonna Taylor verdict. And so when we came out with the episode, we were really concerned about whether we should actually produce the episode at that time, should we release it? And we ended up releasing it because we recognized that our friendships are actually a lot more powerful in terms of impacting and fighting racial injustice than I think that we give credit to. And so this particular episode, Josephine and I, as a Black woman, as a Korean American woman, just discussed our own experiences in multi-ethnic friendships, but also what our friendships have actually kind of helped us heal, and also kind of some of the trauma that we've experienced in our friendships as well as women of color. But I think there were really some three main points that we wanted to make sure we got across in that particular episode, and that I would like you all to know today if you haven't heard the episode. And the first one that Josephine said was friendship is a place of healing, and also a place of education. The second one was that as friends, we're actually called to bear each other's burdens, to mourn with those who mourn, and to rejoice with those who rejoice. And so within a friendship, to kind of prevent it from being a token-like relationship, or having that one Black friend, or that one Indian friend, you are actually actively supporting and also caring for your friend in a way in which you don't have to otherwise. And we talked specifically about some friendships where a white friend might be able to kind of distance themselves from the burdens or the cares of that friend of color, but that's actually not true friendship. True friendship says that you will embrace them fully as who they are, but you will also embrace their communities and their challenges, and be with them weeping even when they don't feel like you would need to. So that was one thing two things we wanted to make sure we got across. And then the other thing was just recognizing that as people, we desire to have great systems. We desire to eradicate things that do plague our nation, like racism. But the first start for that, we really believe, is friendship, because it's a relationship that is a bond beyond kind of a law, or beyond a kind of like human capacity to just care for one another. It's actually just really deep. And so we wanted that to kind of be a focus. We saw a lot of friends of ours and just followers, Instagram followers, Facebook friends, posting for Blackout Tuesday, which was fantastic. But we also recognize that a picture on an Instagram is nothing compared to an actual relationship with somebody. And so if we actually want to achieve the systems, and we actually want to white supremacy, then we actually need to develop friendships that make us care for one another beyond traditional ways.
Great, thank you, Kindred. Okay, so all of us were fairly succinct, which is great because we can have a longer, involved discussion. And I have questions for you, and we are starting to get questions in the Q&A, or in the Q&A box. So we will then, maybe have more time for Q&A as well. So first, I just really want to say that it's wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to these presentations, and I feel like we just got a kernel of how meaningful and involved your experiences were. So I definitely want to hear more about this, and hopefully my questions will make you feel welcome to share things that you didn't get to say in your brief presentation. I also want to abuse my power at this moment just to tell my students and these students and my colleagues, both faculty and staff, hello. This is a period where we feel, I think, fairly isolated. So when asked to do this, I jumped at the chance because it's an opportunity to be a part of the community, and community seems to be, a theme running through all of your presentations. So I'm gonna head out with a big question, okay? So, but I like, anyone who has a class with me knows that I'm always about definitions, defining terms. And, the title of this panel is called The Movement for Racial Justice. And I want to talk about the movement, or concept of a movement, in a second. But first, I want to ask you what the term or the concept of racial justice means to you, and how you feel through your particular experiences related to the work that you did over the summer or elsewise, how you feel that you've engaged that concept. So like I said, it's a big concept, but I feel like I've heard racial justice bandied about a lot, particularly since the murder of George Floyd. And so I want to put some meaning to that. So would anyone like to weigh in on that?
I guess I can go first. I feel like I don't really have a definition of racial justice, but I have like key foundations that I believe impart ideas of racial justice. I think that racial justice is decolonization. I think racial justice is prison abolition and not defunding the police, but abolishing the police. I think racial justice is no ICE. Like all of these things that people like, racial justice isn't reform, it's like the abolition of these systems. And racial justice can't be achieved through making incremental change, because I don't think that, like, we've been seeing incremental change for years, and it's like my grandmother marched in the civil rights movement. I don't want to get to her age and then have my kids, like my grandchildren, like keep marching, keep fighting. And it's like incremental change I don't think will cause true liberation, specifically for Black and Indigenous folks in this country. Like we need like change now, not change tomorrow.
Others?
Like you shared, that is a very challenging question. And I think because so many people have different definitions of many words, and racial justice included, I feel for me that the active portion is most important. And if beyond sharing what people think about racial justice themselves, I think when it gets stuck into an abstract argument and it's just debate and it's just, I don't agree with definition. I do, and it just stays up here. I get a little bit anxious, and I want it to come back to the ground, and I want it to be something that is actively moving things. And Kindred and I, we talk a lot about maintenance of friendship. And if we have friends that look exactly like us and think exactly like us, then that might not be contributing to fighting against racial injustice. And so when it also comes to responding to these protests or educating ourselves about it, I ask myself, like, I can't only help people who look like me. And so what can I do? Like, how can I be a better friend? And I think using the word friend is very key for me because it brings it back down to that personal level.
Mm-hmm. I want to give Kindred or Teran a chance to weigh in there, but I want to stick a pin in that idea of friendship and also allyship, because I think I would love to hear discussion about the distinction between those, if you feel there's a distinction between them. But Kindred or Teran, did you have anything you wanted to say on this concept of racial justice? And I should say that part of the reason that I ask is because of the protests, particularly those that were happening in late May and June, the constant chant was racial justice, Black Lives Matter, racial justice, defund the police. Black Lives Matter, I think, is, fairly self-evident or self-explanatory. Defund the police had a lot of, different definitions or ideas to it, but racial justice, to your point, Josephine, could seem like an abstract that seemed like a call for action, but might take place of a call for or action, to your point, Josephine. So Kindred or Teran?
Yeah, I was actually gonna approach her. Can I talk about your allyship versus friendship?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think it's an awesome, discussion and topic, because I think often we do equate the two, but I think you can very well be an ally and not a friend to somebody, and I think that is problematic. And I think that we saw that a lot with kind of how social media kind of picked up the Black Lives Matter movement, at least on my particular feed. And I saw a lot of people that I think would consider themselves to be allies to the Black community, but I actually would not consider them to be friends to the Black community, because I'll go through their Instagram page and I'll see entirely, one race in their photos, and that one Black square. And I was like, oh, that one Black square is supposed to represent you're an ally with me, but the rest of your life and the rest of your friend group actually does not represent that as well. And I think, I forget the book, but I think it was We Want to Survive by, I always forget, but she wrote a book about how we want to be co-conspirators rather than simply allies. And I think that friendship is a space to be a co-conspirator, because now it goes beyond whether I think allyship can sway depending on what's occurring in the moment, right? So if if the world is fighting this injustice together, then like an ally steps up and is able to fight that injustice with them. But like a true friend will actually stay with you when the world kind of quiets down about something that the rest of the world may not be really caring about in that moment. I think it was like just to think about the ways in which like I think allies have stepped up to maybe protest or speak out, but a friend I think steps up and has a willingness to bear the burden for like continual amount of time rather than for like a siloed event in history. And so that's what we were kind of really trying to get out in our particular episode, but I think also model in like how we talk to one another on our podcast as like friends who are different races, is recognizing that like I actually like I do care about movements that are happening in your community, but I actually care about it beyond just simply the moment. I care about you and like how it affects you and the people that are related to you. And so that makes me want to kind of stay with the movement even if the rest of the world doesn't want to.
You know, a question that this is implied in what you just said, Kindred, but do any of you have examples of non-allyship, right? Particularly from those who consider themselves allies, because I do think that there's often good intent, but allyship can be problematic, which you, again, Kindred, you implied, but you talked about it more in terms of what people could do. I wondered if there were things that any of you would.
I was wondering if I could jump in on this one. This is something that I think really irked me all summer, was this idea of like social media allyship and people who I know like in my day-to-day life say things that are definitely not ally things to say or friend things to say the Black community, but then on social media they like post their Black square and they like post a screenshot of a actual $3.25 donation, which is the like weirdest number ever. And just like these Instagram posts that seem like allyship, but in my opinion aren't. And I had a lot of my friends reach out to me over the summer, like, why aren't you posting on Instagram every day? Like, you talk about racial justice all the time. Like, how come you're not doing your job? And I'm like, I'm not a social media person. I'm, working for a criminal justice reform nonprofit, down in Georgia. Like, I think this like idea that the definition of allyship is what you post on social media and not what you do in your real life and the action that you take to be part of the movement, or even just like being a real ally in real life. Because I know that social media is a huge part of our real lives now, but I do not think it's enough. And I don't think it replaces like being a real friend and also like taking real action.
It's hard to have a conversation with all of you, I mean, in the best way, because questions are just firing off in my mind because of your different initiatives, but also the things that you're saying. Because one of the things I was thinking about, Teran, when you presented, but then also Josephine and Kindred in your examples, was the role of technology and current technology and how that plays into the movement for racial justice. And each of you have, harnessed it or mobilized it in a way that contributes to the change that you think is necessary, or at least is part of the change that you think is necessary. But I wonder for all of you, Teran, you just spoke about social media, kind of the complexity of social media in terms of it being a tool or maybe actually a hindrance. I wondered if any of you had thoughts about the different ways that, or have examples of how, in addition to what you're doing or more information about what you're doing, where you felt like technologies of today were very useful or could be useful or maybe being misused, but could be very useful.
Iris, go ahead.
I was gonna say, the most obvious thing for me was like the generation of like financial support. Like, I don't think that I would have gotten that if like the internet, like if Venmo and like PayPal and stuff did not exist, then like there would be like no money to like buy these like groceries with. And I also feel like spreading the word about like like I'm not the only person in Chicago that had a mutual aid project. Like a lot of my friends did, like, and like one of my friends, like they did theirs like twice a week with like fresh meat and dairy for like the community. So it's like, even that, it's like, that's something that like with social media, you were able to be like, oh, this time and this time, like I could go here and receive like all the groceries that I would need for a week. And I don't think, because like the news, like the traditional news sources do not broadcast these things, like social media is like very, very useful. Or even like at different protests that I like, my friends or I have attended, like if someone needed jail support for being like arrested, then that's when like social media was very needed. Or the idea of posting bail for someone, like I feel like on ground roots activism, like of course, like that type of like allyship versus friend versus accomplice, like I'm not really checking for those people that do those black squares. Like those people are my friends, so I don't really care about them. But I do check for the people that like actually are using social media to advance the actual like tangible lives of black people, and not like these black friends that they want to just have on their arm or like for the picture.
It's really I mean, your initiative actually really is reassuring to me, because I think I've gotten a little cynical about social media, particularly in relationship to racial justice, and that oftentimes I think it does take the form or allow people to feel as if they're performing activists, or it gives us a platform to sound off. But before I heard you in your presentation, Iris, I just kept thinking, how did she do this? How did she do this? And then it became very clear that you harness social media and, and platforms like Venmo to be able to make all of that happen, where I would have just thought, oh, I really wish I could get groceries to people, but I don't know how to do that. And so what I see from your example is having used social media as a communication, as a connecting advice versus a sounding off or an individual platform, or look at my activism in that sense. So it's really inspiring to me to see that example. Other people want to, or the rest of you want to weigh in on that? Josephine, you had your hand before.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I think social media has that consumption side and it has the creation side. And in my opinion, the creation side seems to be the more positive aspect of it. But during the time of the protests, when it just swelled, I felt like social media was not helpful. And I actually stopped using it. And I was like, I'm not going to come back for 2 years because I was so tired of it. And then I had a VChat conversation with Kindred, and I just wanted to, keep maintaining my friends outside of my social media. I wanted to prove it was possible to myself. And in the midst of that chat, we realized after like the 3+ hour mark, we're like, there's so much here that we want to share with others. And Kendra was like, maybe you should just like record this conversation. Maybe it could be a podcast. And I had a little bit of podcast experience from my history projects, and I knew that it could be a powerful tool because you take away the visual stimuli and it's just voices. And it's really powerful when, women of color and their voices are kind of silenced. And so we were actively like, we're going to do a podcast because it's symbolic. And also you could just put in so much more information in a approachable way. And so for me, that was something worth opening my social media platforms back up. Like, and I don't really want to use it in other ways besides the creation part.
Well, and you took, Kindred and Josephine, you took control of the narrative by having your own podcast. Not only did you get your voices out there, but you took control of the narrative, and through each podcast, you're adding to that narrative. Talking about these platforms and stuff, I just want to take it in a little different direction, because Iris, you spoke some to this, and Teran, in your work, you were both engaging very structural aspects of racial justice. And I really wanted to hear you all speak more to, this is the first time in my life I've heard structural racism or systemic racism become a mainstream topic of conversation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, or your experience of trying to address structural racism through the experiential learning, or just generally. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I guess for me, like, I don't know, I feel like living in Chicago, like you're kind of born like a sociologist or something, like especially if you like live on the South Side, like racism is like all the racism that you see, because it's so segregated, there are not really microaggressions. There's only mainly like a systemic type of racism that you experience when you live on the South and West Side. It's like things like, oh, like why doesn't my community have like no grocery stores, or like why is there like more trash on this side of the city than this side of the city? Or even for me, like my senior year of high school, like me and my friend Maxine, we did a TED talk about like the Chicago public school system and how that's structurally based around racism. And these ideas of like structural racism can't be, I feel like, ignored any longer, nor do I think that like they have been ignored, especially at least for me. I feel like every aspect of my life has been affected by some type of structural racism. And even with this the Southside grocery pickup, I was just thinking, like, it's just interesting to think about how, like, as Black people, like, we grew the food for this country, and yet like we have, like, at least in, like, we live in food deserts. Like, is that not weird to think about how like we literally were in agriculture and still are in agriculture, but we don't have access to these things? Like, that is like one of the most fundamental, I feel like, ideas of even thinking about like structural racism that need to be addressed. And food is a human right. I think the access to healthy food is a human right. And like, even just like, there is not really access to healthy food. Like, even just having things like lettuce, cabbage, greens, like kale, like all these things we take for granted, like these things are like things that a lot of people like don't have in their communities. And I feel like the project of Southside Grocery Pickup allocated for, of course, not like wealth distribution in, like, I don't know, like a Marxist sense, but allowed for people to like redistribute their wealth, or even their just resources that lived either in the suburbs of Chicago or the north side of Chicago, to be like, what you have, or like this abundance of wealth that you have, there is a large part of Chicago that do not have these resources. And it could be argued that your resources were built off the backs of these people that don't have any resources.
Mm-hmm. I think, you talk about living on the South Side of Chicago and just kind of experiencing and being aware of or conscious of structural racism. But your grocery pickup also, I think, really revealed it, for people who might not be aware, but just, watching the groceries disappear so fast, and seeing the needs, particularly with schools closed or schools being remote in that sense. I'm glad this is being recorded, because I want to say to you, you should do something with this. You have to, like, write this up or talk more about it, because I think it speaks to very well to the systemic nature of racism. But you've done enough. So we'll just let this or other people share what we learned from you. But I do think your activities this summer are really revelatory in that sense. Teran, I'm really struck by the fact that you were working with criminal justice, or with the justice system, and with elected officials in a way. And I'd love to hear you talk about that in terms of structure, in terms of how that relates to racial justice.
Yeah, I think when I think about or talk about systemic racism and structural racism, it can feel so overwhelming and futile because, you know, I imagine this is like amorphous thing, like how are we going to take down like a whole structure, a whole system? But like something that I kept reminding myself this summer is like these structures and systems are all made up of people. Everything we build in society is made up of people and people making choices, and to take down a system, we have to remove certain people from power. And we talked about in IDJ, when we were, you know, working on this stuff, like, you know, sentences like, could you imagine, you know, we put these resources up for voters and we vote, you know, this many district attorneys out of Georgia, and we vote district attorneys in who believe in implementing this, and this policy, like in the span of one election. You know, these are the things that we can change structurally just by voting different people into office. And I think because we focus so like heavily just in general on national elections and national policy, we do not realize how like tangibly we can implement change at the local level and how it can, you know, impact so many people's lives. Because national officials are not running our, you know, local jails and our local prisons as local officials. And so I think something for me this summer was just, you know, kind of taking a more narrow viewpoint and looking at the systems more narrowly, instead of like, how are we going to change this whole structure and this whole system, of like, you know, looking for exactly who is implementing policies in which areas and how we can make change. And change at the local level isn't enough, but I definitely think it's a place to start for.
Yeah, and it's customized and it's immediate, right? You know, and I think right now we're in a time where the presidential election is sucking all of the oxygen out of the room. And one of the things that I know, you know, from reading more about your activities is, as you stated, the importance of voting down the ballot. And I just think that's a really important message right now. And I thank you for writing it, because it, you know, one, I'm saying it here, but I also really, it reminded me, yes, because I am so focused on the presidential election, and that, you know, in a real way that may or may not do much for my actual, you know, day-to-day living. So I think that's a really good point. Josephine or Kindred, did you have anything that you wanted to weigh in there? It's okay if you don't. I certainly have more questions. Okay, well, one of the things then is, you know, Iris, you spoke to, you know, radical change in the beginning, radical change being necessary. And, you know, and Teran, you've put it, you know, like that is possible step by step on a local level. I'm wondering what you all identify as the biggest hindrances to structural change.
Can I start off?
Of course.
I think our structure in this country is not built for structural change. It was built to stay the way it was, and it wants to stay the way it is. It does not like change, and everything happens very slowly. And I think the biggest hindrance to structural change in the structure we're living in is that it fundamentally doesn't want that. When I get frustrated about things like this, I think about voter suppression, I think about gerrymandering, and I think about all of these ways in which the structure is kind of pushing away from us being able to change it. And that's all I'm going to say.
Well, anyone who's taken a class with me would, you know, your comments would fit in well, because we talk about our culture and our political, economic, and social systems in relationship to changing systemic race, or just changing systems. And I would definitely ask you to speak more to it in a class, and I think you probably wouldn't have to, because I think others would weigh in. Would anyone else like to weigh in? Josephine?
I was just going to say, I think one of the greatest hindrances is not identifying with another person that's different than you, and not wanting to, like not feeling the need to. There are countless reasons maybe, but I think that kind of mindset it tends to be taught from the home and local communities, and it's more challenging to fight against that. And coming from, I can't speak for the entirety of the Asian community, but there is historical sentiments against certain communities, and I think that just learning about it and also trying to actively be responsible for it is good, but at the end of the day, if we still can't see the other person as a person, and we put all this like historical reasoning to put even more distance between us, I think it leaves us in the same place.
Mhm.
And so while educating ourselves is so important, I think at the end of the day, just again, I don't want to like nail this head too much, but wanting to be friends and weighing for myself why, and why should I want to take burden or sacrifice or responsibility, and for the other person as well. And that has to be walked through in a very personal level, I believe.
And ideal, friendship would be the ideal, but even just, I think that empathy part is so important because, and a lot of times I think it's important to remember that empathy does not necessarily mean sympathy or accepting someone's position, but empathy, trying to relate to someone. I think I agree. I think that's a really important dynamic, one that is getting interrupted a lot, I think, by the moment that we're living in, right? I mean, just trying to relate to people is difficult. I'm trying to be around people is difficult. Iris, you had your hand there.
Yeah, I was gonna like emphasize the point Josephine made about like not like people not seeing other people as human beings. I feel like that, and like because we live in such an individualist society, I feel like the combination of those things don't really allow like structural change. Like for me, it's just like how can we argue for things like food and education being a human right if you don't see me as a human being?
Mhm.
Like I feel like that's the issue at heart, and I feel like I'm not really well versed in this, but I feel like people like Calvin Warren and like almost like Afro pessimists talk about that type of idea a lot, about like Black people specifically not really being pushed as aside as like an other, like a non-being in a way. And I think because we create societies where like not even just based off of race, but things of like gender, sexuality, gender expression, like all these things where we classify people as like, you're not like me, you're like this, and I'm going to push you to the side. I feel like it doesn't create the idea of structural change. And I feel like that's why like the idea of like communal care is so important, not like self-care, which I feel like is talked about a lot in the media, but almost like a communal care in which like we care for people beyond ourselves. And I feel like that is very like, that is an act of liberation in itself. It's like as like marginalized people or like any access of our identity, like creating a true environment of care that like empowers one another. I feel like those are like small steps, but steps nonetheless to create like a type of change.
I'm gonna throw one more question out there, and then I want to turn it over to Q&A. I do see questions in the Q&A box. This is a big question. So I don't know, with 2 minutes or so, that it's fair to ask you, but do you, we've spent the last several months seeing protests. Something happened after the George Floyd killing that is different. But do you see, or would you classify it as a movement for racial justice? Do you see a movement for racial justice right now? And if so, in what form? Yeah, Iris?
I think that I would classify it as a movement just because like I think people have this idea that like people in the 60s were protesting every single day for months at a time, but like people are people and no one can sustain that. I feel like, and specifically because of the news, like I don't know what's happening in Portland right now. Like it's like major like uprisings were happening, and I feel like the news just like cut them off. And I'm also thinking about like Black liberation struggles globally, and how in Nigeria, like people are protesting to end a portion of like the police department, not in Nigeria. So I feel like the United States has started something that is migrating to be almost like a global like act of liberation, or a global fight for liberation. I think that this election, depending on which way it goes, that there will be a lot more protests happening.
Mhm.
And I feel like now is just the time for people to kind of like rest and grow. And then because people are tired, and it's like it's normal to be tired, it's normal to be exhausted. Like I highly doubt that like Huey Newton wasn't tired. So I feel like now is just a time of rest to fight again.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a really good point. Certainly, civil rights activists and Black Power activists weren't every day doom, and right now there's just so much more happening to crowd out different things or make it difficult to see what is happening. I'll throw out a recommendation for a book that's called Making All Black Lives Matter, which is written by Barbara Ransby. And for me, it was very useful in giving a local, seeing how things were happening, Teran, to your point, on a local level. So I had some aspect when it was hard to get maybe a bird's eye view of a movie. I really had some aspect of what was happening and the different ways things were happening. And that movement doesn't necessarily have to be this national, thing that's happening, but has, a lot of bits and pieces happening around nationally or globally, to your point, Iris. Other thoughts on that?
I was thinking about it, and I think like I agree with Iris. I think we're definitely like in like I think the fight for racial injustice is like ongoing, and so I like often like see it as like I don't know, I haven't been around that long, but it seems like from what I've read in history that it like comes in so many different waves, and so like the civil rights movement of like the 1960s like inspires like Nelson Mandela and like apartheid, right? And so like just like these different like fights have like continually like moved off of one another, and like we learn from one another. But I think it's Martin Luther King and Rabbi Heschel. I think I'm pronouncing it right, but they were like close friends. And like I think about like how when they like fought with one another and like marched with one another, they would say like they felt like their legs were praying, was like one of the ways they would talk about it. But that like they like actively, I think, could work with what like their relationship was in itself like a fight towards racial injustice, right? And like that like they were marching at times together, but they also like the times that they were eating together and just like caring for one another and like bringing each other into their different communities and into their synagogues or churches, like they were actively kind of like making a battle or making progress towards racial justice. And so I guess I think of like the fight for racial injustice is ongoing, but I think it's often like the best and I think the strongest work happens behind the scenes in order for like the things that we see before us to actually be like actually created and actually done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to open it up to some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A, and I've been trying to just kind of get a sense of them really quickly. And I think I might combine a couple because I want to bring in the dynamics or bring in the kernels of several of them. There's a question here about microaggressions. There's also a question here about self-care. And Iris, you spoke to each of these in a sense, but I want to take those and ask you, in our current moment, I know from teaching during term one that, students, faculty, there's a malaise kind of happening right now from being separated from one another, from just kind of wondering what's going to happen. And more than self-care or how you deal with maybe in like microaggressions, for lack of a better, I'm not a big fan of the term microaggressions. But how you deal with racism coming into your own lives. You've each given us ways that really speak to community or engaging the community or thinking like a community. And I'm wondering how right now you might direct the attendees to this webinar, what advice you might have for them to take a rest, as Iris said, but to stay connected in a way that is actually useful to a fight against racial justice, or the fight against racial justice.
So for friendships, I feel like there's like the partnership aspect of it, and then there is the comfort of it. And I'll just speak in the context of the podcast Kendra and I made, but just because it's the most direct at this point. But we started in August, and we've been just going at it, and every week releasing something, and it's tiring, and it's not hard. I mean, it's hard to sustain, and we just chat weekly about it, but we also try not to chat about it because we're like, our friendship is more than just this. And so we decided to actually close the season because we wanted to take a rest, and we didn't want it to be the end of this conversation. So I think someone brought up here the metaphor of like the ocean or the waves, it coming in waves. And I was thinking of the ocean too, like the waves beat at the sand, but it draws back and it comes back, it draws back. And I think that there is, I don't want to say an instinct, maybe that's not the right word, but I think there's a power that comes from reflection and from pivoting and coming back right at it again. And that's only possible when we recognize our limitations. And for me, like recognizing my limitations, like I'm not a superwoman. I can't do this all by myself, but I think resting together is really powerful too. In this time where we're prepping for season 2, for example, Kindred and I, we just want to like hang out. And we also will reach out to our individual friends and be like, what did you think? Like, is there something you want to hear from us? But doing that on a very low key level.
You got to pace yourselves.
For the long run.
Yeah, this is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. Kindred, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just gonna like kind of balance off of what Josephine is saying. It's like, I think for me, my friendships like have been a way of like resting, especially because like I'm an incredibly extroverted person. Like I just love being around people. But also because like after like the murder of George Floyd, like I live with my family and like we're all African American. And so like walking around in the house, it was like, you know, like we didn't really have to talk about what happened because we just like knew, and like we would like start talking about it and then like stop, you know, and like there's like this like heaviness, you know, and so it wasn't always like something we like wanted to dive deep into, even though we kind of would naturally because of who we are. But I found that like during that time when I didn't really know like what I was working through at the moment, and I didn't really know like how to vocalize it, like I had like a white friend like text me and call me and was like, I don't know if you want to talk about this. You don't have to. Like, I'm just really distraught. And like, I want to check on you and make sure you're okay. And how like, I know I can't help, you know, but I know I can be there. And I think like that, like brief relationship actually kind of gave a lot of life to like me and my family of being like, I think it's really easy for it to become so like one system can like become an entire group of people. And I definitely think that we should like target, you know, systems. But I think for me in that moment, what I needed was actually just like the reminder that like, it wasn't like, this is not strictly a battle against like one person versus another. And so like, it was like a nice breath of like, okay, like I can still like, you know, be angry and like still like have like this moment of like love and care from somebody that actually in that moment was like representing like a group of people that have like harmed me and people like me. And so it was just like, I don't know if I'm completely explaining it well, but I think it was just like a nice like breather. And I have found that to actually be a very life-giving is like when I do have conversations with Josephine about racial issues, like her response like to racial issues in the Black community like is often like with like compassion and empathy and like the space of like, do you want to talk about it? If you don't want to talk about it, we don't talk about it. And I think like that also just kind of like it lights in me like a desire to like, oh wait, there's actually so much more to fight for. It's not like so simple as like, oh, it's all over, this is it, like people are just evil, you know, which is really helpful.
Well, I'm looking at the time, and I just want to say one last thing for the four of you, but also for our attendees on that issue of self-care. Definitely, I think we have to take care of ourselves, but it's no coincidence, I think, that self-care is something that's generally advice given to women and or marginalized groups. I think we also have to make people take care of us. I think that people should be taking care of us. So I want to thank you all for taking care of your community members and for taking care of one another and for sharing that experience with us and giving us some guidance or a model of how we might do that for ourselves and with our community. And to thank you for the work that you did and sharing that with us. And thank you for the attendees. And I hope that you will check out the panel tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.